So we've been basically putting just some initial, given that we've got a relatively limited amount of time here over the next 20 to 25 minutes, we've just been putting some initial thoughts down on paper that we'd love to have your input on, and just kind of build on the document as well, with the idea that when we get to the other side of this meeting, we'll have something to be able to post on the IdeaNote platform and have as kind of a working document. So let me share the screen here really quick. Can everyone see that?
Yep.
Okay, great.
Yeah. So maybe, James, I'll kind of start, because I think it's really important that we emphasize what the current problem is and how TBI fits in with the grand challenges, because I think that's the most important, and a lot of the details I think will eventually come with discussion. But myself and some of my colleagues in brain injury research felt quite strongly that TBI is really a distinct neurological event that is quite different than being considered another degenerative disease like dementia or Alzheimer's. And that's kind of an important aspect that we want to focus, because that difference in process is what makes us actually truly multidisciplinary, where most of the other neurodegenerative diseases typically are a slow building process that affect the elderly population. Traumatic brain injury is really something that happens suddenly to pretty much anyone in the community, whether it's yourself, your partner, your parents, or your children. And so this is a topic area that really hits home in our communities, and in particular, our community within Charlottesville and our high school athletes, our students at UVA, both young people going out and doing silly things, driving, and our student athletes. But then beyond that, with a lot of our military personnel in the state of Virginia. And so it's really a local and regional problem that then expands globally. And that really fits in with the message that we keep hearing from President Ryan to address solutions for our community. The other thing is traumatic brain injuries is really a huge factor, especially in cases of severe TBI with the young population, where you could potentially have someone who is disabled for their entire lifetime. This is not a disease that is, exists for a few years, and that then that person may be deceased. It is something that in certain cases we may have to deal with over the long term. And I think it's probably unrecognized even today, as heightened we are about repetitive head injuries or head impacts and concussion. I think we're still probably just finding out how important this topic is overall in someone's health. I don't want to be a fearmonger, but even the mildest cases of concussion and severe traumatic brain injury can come from car accidents, falls, assaults, athletics, recreational activities. This is something that really can happen to anyone. I want to emphasize that, as well as our military members are at risk on the battlefield, not just with ballistics, but also blast wave interactions. And that seems to be a real big topic to try to study what's going on there. So we really are unique in that the cases that we see in traumatic brain injury many times, and there's many opportunities that with better technology, engineering, guidelines, we can actually prevent a lot of these. So this is not a reactive topic where we have to treat someone who comes in displaying symptoms. This is a full lifetime of research and science that we can implement, both on the prevention side, and the treatment side, and the long-term health benefits. And so we feel that alone really kind of classifies this particular problem as quite unique and different than a lot of other neurodegenerative issues. UVA, I would say, has a really long history of multidisciplinary TBI research, from anywhere from biomechanics, which is what I study, to imaging, preclinical models, pathology research and neuroscience, as well as symptom management and clinical practice. And that just is the ones that I'm kind of pulling off my head here. Our expertise not only spans all these different disciplinaries, but over the entire spectrum of the injury. So studying what's going to happen in a person that has a head exposure, all the way to what happens after someone has spent a lifetime playing contact sports that may be exhibiting signs that look like neurodegeneration. So we exist in this space already. We're actually quite prominent, and we've done really well for ourselves, but a lot of that has to do with working kind of in silos. There has been, and this is really what's the grand challenge is all about. And I think this whole mechanism that the VPR and the president have established for us at UVA really hits home to TBI. We are many different expertise across, I think, every school in the university, including multiple departments in each school. Some of us have worked together to try to organically build a really cohesive multidisciplinary unit, but we've done that kind of on our own practice, our own time, without a substantial amount of institutional support to really help build us to this more multidisciplinary and comprehensive organization that I think we can be. So again, I just want to say that in my opinion, at least, that I'm fairly biased, TBI research at UVA is perfectly suited for this type of grand challenge. And in fact, it almost looks like they wrote the grand challenge based on seeing what strengths we have at UVA already, like in TBI, and saying, hey, you know what, we could actually take these people and help merge them together to go from that prominence that we individually have already to a preeminent institution that will put us right up there with some of the world leading institutions right now. And so that's what I wanted to stress and really make that case. And we're going to make this case to the president's office. Yeah. And so our vision, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Yeah. So we focused on, and James has got a document here that he's pulling up on the screen, a number of areas that we're particularly strong in traumatic brain injury, and there's certainly others, and it's a big long list that we can go and include everybody in. But our goal is really to develop a center model for TBI research that's paralleled with a lot of the other top universities that are recognized as world leaders in this area, such as University of Pennsylvania or the University of Kentucky. And in fact, I think James has mentioned multiple times is that the breadth of expertise that we have at UVA actually exceeds those particular institutions. And really what we're looking for is the organizational or the institutional support to form a cohesive organization where all of a sudden all these different disciplines are able to interact, collaborate, and have the ability to act as a cohesive research unit, rather than a number of people working kind of separately and hoping that you bump into each other every now and again when you're crossing grounds to say, hey, we should talk. What you're doing is great. What I'm doing is great. And you know what? There's probably synergy between those. Sorry, go ahead, James.
Sorry, I'm just kind of watching the clock here a little bit, and I know we've got just a little under 15 minutes left. And not to cut you off, but I'd love to hear sort of thoughts from some of the other folks around what their thoughts are around TBI, what their sort of vision is for TBI and how we can help improve the community in general. And again, Matt, I think you've made a number of really important points here, and I wish we had more time, but maybe we can pause here and just get some thoughts from the group.
Thanks, James.
Well, I'll just chime in very briefly. This is Donna. So Matt and myself, James and Jake wrote this document. So we've already had our input through writing this document, but I think there's some very major key points. We do span from incredibly sophisticated engineering work through imaging, through clinical management, clinical evaluation, treatment. And I think that is a very important cornerstone of the collaboration we have. I also want to point out that UVA Health is a major neurotrauma center for patients with traumatic brain injury. They are flown in via Pegasus from all over to receive their care here. And so we are very poised to do cutting edge research to make a very big difference for these patients. And as Matt noted, that's everything from infants and toddlers who have traumatic brain injuries up to the elderly and throughout the entire lifespan. And so making a difference for these patients can make a very significant difference in the lives of many.
Yeah, I think that's a great point.
Can I jump in here for 1 second? Sorry, my name's Javier Preventio. I'm actually a researcher in the big center. I do inflammation research, but I'm also the medical director of the Neuro ICU. The clinical side is actually a little bit worrisome. And I think it's an area that I'm not sure is a very good area for research. We don't follow most of the guidelines, in part because we have very fractious care that goes between different groups and different units. And we have very little standardization in how we manage these patients, where most centers do. I'm trying, but it's not working well. So I'm not sure that we are such, at least in the adult side, the pediatric side, I don't have any control over, but at least from the adult side, not a particularly good research endeavor right now in the acute end. In the rehab end, maybe, but we would have to basically standardize our care if we're going to get any meaningful research out of this.
So that's obviously critically important, Jose. And I guess the question that I have is, what can we do to elevate our level of clinical research here at UVA around TBI? Because we're obviously very strong from a preclinical translational perspective, and we have a number of other of human subject studies that are occurring as well. But we've really got to have that capstone of good clinical research in order to make sure that we're all sort of moving down an effective pipeline towards things that change care. So what can we do differently? How can we change things on the clinical side?
Well, I mean, there's a national consensus on how to actually treat traumatic brain injury early on, at least in adults. Pediatrics is a little bit less clear, but in that national consensus, there are guidelines for how to treat these things. We just don't always do it. And part of it is patients get admitted to different settings, and part of it, so some of the patients come to my unit, some of the patients come to our trauma unit, our surgical trauma unit, where things are managed very differently, never with the same people. So it just takes a concerted effort to get everybody together and do it together. It's just not as easy at UVA as it is at other institutions to actually get consensus among the clinical staff. So we've made some attempts at it. It's been very difficult to sort of get a big enough consensus to make it work. And some of it is personalities, some of it is it's the UVA way, but that's hampered our ability to study sort of the acute setting of ICH of traumatic brain injury for a while. And the other question I think is interesting is that what we've seen more and more recently is penetrating brain trauma. Mm-hmm. And there's not a lot of work in penetrating brain trauma. And it would be an interesting area to look at, particularly from my standpoint, from the inflammation standpoint. I think it's a fascinating area.
Yeah, there are some folks that we've sort of worked with in a transient way up at Walter Reed Army Institute of Research that have really done much of the preclinical translational work around penetrating brain trauma, and there certainly may be some opportunities for collaboration up there. But I completely agree that when you compare closed head injury and the research from preclinical translational up to clinical to penetrating brain injury, that there's a massive gap there.
And I just want to chime in and also say, I agree 100% about the challenges with the clinical care of patients with the spectrum of traumatic brain injury, particularly moderate to severe. We have also tried to have some meetings and gain some collaborations for a little bit more standardized care for patients with traumatic brain injury. And that's why I just think a Center for Traumatic Brain Injury Research to help demonstrate the importance of collaboration and communication. And, I'm afraid that the UVA way has become shorthand for people not talking to each other and staying in their silos, be it clinical or research. And that's exactly what we need to break through. We need a grand challenge to say, we're all going to talk together, we're all going to collaborate, and we're all going to work together to make things better for patients, both on the clinical perspective and in the research perspective.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, Donna. There's no doubt that the center model does allow for folks to come together in a way that they otherwise would not. Again, University of Pittsburgh, University of Pennsylvania, Kentucky, Miami Center to Cure Paralysis. These are all areas where there are very, very strong TBI center-based activities that does have a halo effect on the clinical activities in those areas as well, certainly by bringing in large-scale clinical trials and helping to influence care from that perspective as well. So it really is, there's a lot of untapped potential here.
One of the obvious things is that the one thing that UVA doesn't have, which all of those centers, Pittsburgh and Kentucky, particularly in Miami have, is a neurosurgeon who is interested in head trauma and head trauma research. That we've not had that here at the University of Virginia. And I think that's been a big piece of it is that, head trauma guidance from the neurosurgery standpoint goes to whoever's available and not necessarily to somebody with a concerted effort or interest in it.
No question. Which is ironic given that, one of the most successful TBI research programs at UVA emerged from neurosurgery. So, the fact that we don't have connectivity from a clinical perspective with somebody who's a strong clinician scientist in that area is definitely a missed opportunity.
James, Jake, you had a question?
Yeah, and Jose, great points. I think another thing to add to that is just a missing infrastructure, though, that you bring at the point of the acute care of patients, but also the idea that having dedicated staff to help bind us together, as Donna said, with a TBI center, but also individuals that can collect common data elements where maybe the day-to-day care does vary. Maybe there are some targets that we could collect and then disseminate that somewhat layer on top of the variability of clinical care as well. So you think about the infrastructure that could be missing from postdoctoral fellowships to research coordinators and whatnot to add to and help us synergize our collective efforts when studying TBI along the spectrum.
Hi, this is Rahul Sharma. I'm an associate professor in the Division of Nephrology, and I'm an immunologist studying kidney injury. And then I'm really intrigued by the traumatic brain injury, especially the neuroinflammation aspect, because we know that through our work in kidney and pancreas, that acute injury, for most part, leads to chronic injury and chronic dysfunction. And what we study in our laboratory are immune cells that regulate tissue homeostasis. So that is an aspect that we would really like to work on. And I think establishing a traumatic brain injury institute would be a really good way where we can interact with people who are already working in this field, and then we can join our forces and some of the expertise that we have with other neuroimmunologists and grow it further. So I was thinking initially that this may be a part of the neuroimmunology group, but I think it could be a separate center in itself. And we would like to certainly be a part of that.
That's great.
Yeah.
One of the big advantages right now of studying at least the human condition is that there's a set of common data elements just came through the NIH for patients with trauma. And we're working right now with the NIH on a set of common data elements looking at coma. And so that actually, between those two data sets, we should be able to actually develop really easy common data elements, develop database work if we want to categorize these patients well, because between those two, we should have a lot of, so it's sort of a good time. The NIH has put a lot of money and interest in these common data elements, at least for human research, which I think is actually pretty helpful.
Yeah, I know there's been a lot of activity in CDEs. On the human side, there's been some published work on preclinical translational common data elements as well for TBI. And of course, there's the Federal Interagency TBI repository that has a ton of human data that's all been collected via the CDEs. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there, particularly, if we consider that in the context of engaging with some of our data science colleagues to try and mine that information. And if we do have sort of a homogeneous way of rolling back out guidelines to the clinical setting, that could be a very short closed loop here at UVA for data discovery and then implementation and study for the overall efficacy of that new knowledge in the setting of clinical care. So again, Jose, I think this really gets back a lot to some of your earlier comments around having standardized guidelines and having a stable framework across which to roll out those guidelines.
So just a question, how is the center at Kentucky funded and at Penn?
Yeah, so both Pennsylvania and Kentucky have very solid state funding for their centers. And this is an area of opportunity, I believe, within the Commonwealth. As some of you may know, back in 2001, the Commonwealth Neurotrauma Initiative was established by the late Senator Emily Couric, and it's really remained a fairly limited program that's funded largely through fees that are paid by individuals who lose their driver's licenses. So when they go to regain their driver's license, they pay a reinstatement fee. And right now, it's basically supporting a relatively limited fund for basic and research and rehabilitative medicine. So I think Pennsylvania and Kentucky are both great examples of thriving centers, both Pittsburgh, UPenn, as well as UK. These are really thriving centers that have done very well based upon a certain level of state funding. And we at least have the initial foundations here within the Commonwealth of Virginia for expanding something like that. But I think it would be important as discussions perhaps are initiated or continued with the Commonwealth that there's some vision around which that investment would be made. Or some working structure. What else? Any other feedback or input from the group? We sort of put together this working document here. It's been formatted based upon Jaideep's recommendations around how to think about these individual brand challenges. And so we have sort of a list here of the different types of research that might be facilitated. Of course, neuroinflammation figures very prominently on that list. Because of its central importance in a variety of different processes, including the injury associated with traumatic brain injury, and it's a strength here at UVA. And so, neuroinflammation is on here. Looking at the connectedness between between understanding injury biomechanics and understanding the pathophysiology of traumatic brain injury is on here. Another element that's on here, which I think is really key for clinical care, is trying to understand what those factors are that may be present early on, which can be predictive of a negative outcome. Of course, one of our best therapies that we have for TBI right now is intensive rehabilitative care. And so if you can identify those individuals who are at risk for having a negative outcome based upon some discriminative feature early on in their clinical course, then these are individuals who you may be able to plug into intensive rehabilitative therapy and perhaps change the natural history of their condition. So these are just a few sort of types of things that we can be looking at. And I'd love to hear from the group if there are things that we're missing that would be helpful for us to include in terms of areas for possibly bringing together this cross-grounds team to answer some of the burning questions in the field of TBI research.
Jake, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I don't want to take away from other opportunities to speak just because, I helped develop this document. But, if you think about the brain injury research that is really revolving around, more specifically sport concussion. It was born at UVA, and brain injury has a well-established history at UVA. And if you think about our capabilities from looking from the basic science, from pre-injury to post-injury, through rehabilitation techniques, recovery, and then also the potential of looking at long-term implications of TBI, whether it's mild to severe. I don't think there's another institution that is as well situated to capitalize on what our current capabilities. We're just missing the binding to bring us together and bring us out of our silos to come together in order to have a TBI center, as well as use resources to push for a mid to senior level investigator or other junior faculty that are filling in the gaps that we're missing. Again, one of the reasons why I came to UVA is because of its historical brain injury research record, and what it's meant for the care of patients throughout the spectrum, whether it's age or for where they are in the injury. I just see we have a huge area to capitalize on, and I'm going to let Jose speak.
Yeah, I was going to say we have about 40 seconds left. So Jose.
So I'll make mine very quickly. Is that one of the things that I think we have to keep in mind is that in the preclinical work that we've done, there's a lot of biomarkers and things we've looked at, but the number one cause of death in patients with severe injury early on is that we tell the families there's no hope and we withdraw support. So early work is critical in changing sort of the outcome of a lot of these people. And I'll stop there.
That's a great point.
And I just wanted to say very briefly that we just also have to emphasize the work done by Matt Panzer and his colleagues on prevention. Their engineering work is so incredibly important in preventing these severe injuries.